invited me, but as always, she tried to hide it behind a smile. It was clear, though, the disappointment in her eyes. I could see how much she longed for family connection, how much she still cared for them, despite all the years of silence and strain. It hurt, knowing how much she had given, how much she had done for us, yet she remained excluded. And I was the only one left to bridge that gap. I didn't know how to fix it, how to make them see what I saw, the kindness, the warmth, the unwavering love my grandmother had always offered, even when they turned their backs. The weekend was quiet, though. It felt strange to be there alone, knowing my family wasn't coming. Grandma and I spent time talking, reminiscing about my dad, about happier times. She told me stories about his childhood, about the things I had never known, things she had kept to herself until now. I listened, absorbing every word, because I knew these memories were all I had left of him. Every laugh, every tear, every moment of his life was wrapped up in her stories. And in that moment, surrounded by the old photographs on the walls and the faint smell of his favorite cologne that still lingered in the house, I realized how precious those moments were. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about my mother and sister. How had it come to this? How had the rift between them and Grandma become so deep? I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what had happened that had made them so cold, so indifferent. But the answers never came. Maybe they didn't have answers themselves, or maybe they were just too hurt, too stubborn to admit their own faults. All I knew was that my family was fractured, and it wasn't going to be an easy fix. By the end of the weekend, I could feel the tension lingering in the air. Grandma didn't say much about my mother's refusal to come. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. The sadness in her eyes was enough to make me want to scream at my mother, to force her to understand what she was doing, what she was losing. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. I could only hope that someday, they would realize what they had done and how much it had hurt her. As I packed my things to leave, Grandma hugged me tight, her frail arms wrapped around me, her words simple but full of love, "Thank you for coming, my dear." And just like that, I left, knowing that I had done what I could, knowing that I had tried. But the weight of the situation, of everything that had happened, still sat heavily on my chest. When I got home, I didn't expect much to change. My mother and sister were there, just like they had been before. Nothing seemed different, and yet everything was. I had seen the difference in my grandmother, the sadness that clung to her every word and gesture, and it made my heart ache. She deserved more, so much more. But I couldn't force them to see that. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, staring out the window, reflecting on the past few days. It felt like the world had shifted, like something had broken inside me. I realized then that the family I once knew was no more. My father was gone, and with him, a sense of unity, a sense of purpose had vanished. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I would never stop fighting for the relationships that mattered most to me. And if that meant standing by my grandmother when no one else would, then so be it. But deep down, a part of me wondered if things would ever go back to how they were. Or if this was the beginning of something even more painful, a realization that some wounds run too deep to heal. She wanted something in return. The audacity was palpable. My grandmother, who had been nothing but kind and patient with her all these years, just stood there, listening to her words without a hint of forgiveness. I could see the disappointment clouding her face. She didn't even have to say anything for me to understand how deeply hurt she was by their selfishness. Her gaze, hard and cold, told a story of years of putting up with their behavior for the sake of family ties, but now, those ties had frayed beyond repair. My mother's attempt to smooth things over by manipulating the situation felt like a slap in the face to my grandma's years of sacrifice and understanding. My sister, standing by her side with tears in her eyes, tried to join in the pleading, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. They weren't here out of remorse, they were here because they realized they had screwed up, and now they wanted a piece of the pie. The business, the legacy, all of it. It was like a light bulb went off in their heads, and they thought they could just waltz back into my grandmother's life when it was convenient for them. But my grandmother wasn't buying it. Not anymore. She had endured enough of their entitled attitudes, and I could feel the change in her. Her kindness had limits, and those limits had been crossed. She didn't need their apologies, what she needed was respect, and that had been sorely lacking. As my mother and sister stood there, fumbling for the right words, I realized that what they were doing wasn't just an apology, it was a calculated move, an attempt to salvage something that had slipped through their fingers. They weren't interested in healing relationships or making amends. They were only concerned with what they could gain from this sudden shift in their fortunes. And as for me, I wasn't going to stand by and let them tear everything down just because they realized too late that family meant something. The arrogance, the entitlement, this wasn't just about a business, it was about the way they had treated someone who had loved them, who had supported them. It was about dignity. It was about respect. And in that moment, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of satisfaction. Perhaps it was petty, but seeing them struggle to make amends when it was far too late felt like justice for the years of hurt they had caused. So, as they stood there, begging for forgiveness, I watched quietly, knowing that whatever happened next, the decision had already been made. My grandmother had made her choice, and I had made mine. There was no going back. The tension was thick in the air, thick enough to slice with a knife. My mother was standing there, ranting on and on, with nothing but a thin veil of false concern for the family business she so desperately craved. Her words dripped with insincerity, and it was clear, so painfully clear, that she thought my grandmother was going to welcome her with open arms. But my grandma wasn't having any of it. Without missing a beat, she cut through the nonsense with the precision of someone who had seen it all before. She told my mother, quite plainly, that she could just go home because, frankly, my grandmother didn't care to hear any more of her excuses. There was no apology, no remorse for the years of strained, selfish behavior, nothing. My grandma wasn't going to waste a moment more on her. It was in that moment that my grandmother truly showed who she was. She wasn't afraid to speak her truth. Pathetic, she said, the word cutting through the air like a sharp blade. And it wasn't even surprising to her. After all, she had seen this pattern from my mother for years. My grandma had tried. She'd really tried. She'd tolerated all the drama, all the manipulation, all for the sake of my father, but enough was enough. She had even extended an olive branch, inviting my mother to this weekend, believing that my father would have wanted it. But my mother had squandered that chance with her selfishness. My grandmother wasn't having it anymore. She didn't need to be around this toxic mess. And then came the final blow. Go home and cry in your own house. Don't waste our time, she said, slamming the door with a finality that rang in the silence that followed. I stood there, watching it unfold. I didn't intervene. Not even when the door slammed shut in my mother's face. Why would I? I didn't feel like there was anything wrong with what was happening. My grandmother had every right to defend herself. I didn't need to stand up for my mother. I was proud of my grandmother for having the strength to do what was right. I didn't need to be a part of that confrontation. But things didn't end there. No, my mother and sister had other plans. They started blaming me for everything. They were convinced that I should have intervened, should have stood up for them. They argued with me for days, over and over, pushing me to go back home, despite all the history that had just unfolded. But my decision had already been made. I wasn't going back. I had decided to stay with my grandmother. There was no question about it. Still, they thought I was being unfair. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't just make amends, why I wasn't rushing back to their side after everything that had happened. They thought that now that my future was secured, I would forget about them, that I was abandoning them, showing my true colors. It felt suffocating. How could they not see the truth? It was so frustrating, so maddening. I didn't know how to feel anymore, lost in a sea of conflicting emotions. The tension in my family, especially with my mother and sister, was unbearable. They couldn't see things from my perspective. I knew I wasn't in the wrong, no matter how hard they tried to convince me otherwise. And then, the final step, I blocked them. I didn't want to be dragged down any longer by their guilt-tripping and manipulations. They had been given the chance to make things right, but they hadn't. Now, it was their turn to face the consequences of their own actions. I was done. But of course, that didn't go over well. No, they didn't just accept the fact that I had blocked them. They were furious, enraged. And instead of reaching out to me, they turned to social media. They posted their side of the story, painting themselves as the victims, twisting the truth into something that was barely recognizable. The post accused me of deliberately keeping the reason for my visit to my grandmother a secret. They claimed I had known exactly why my grandmother had invited us and had kept it from them, all to steal an opportunity from them and further ruin their already strained relationship. It was all lies. I had nothing to do with any of that. I hadn't even seen the post myself until a relative sent it to me, asking what was going on. I had no idea what to do. Should I confront them? Should I let it go? I didn't want to add to the drama, especially not with my grandmother, who was already grieving the loss of her son. It was becoming too much, too overwhelming. But after a couple of days of wrestling with myself, I knew I couldn't let it slide. I unblocked them. I had to ask them, what was the point of that post? Why spread lies and turn everything into some kind of twisted narrative? It was exhausting. My sister didn't respond, but my mother did. Her reply was exactly what I had expected. She justified her actions, claiming that there was at least some truth in what she had said. According to her, I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, sweet and innocent, when in reality, I was far from it. I had stolen from them, she said. That was it. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Her words hit a nerve, and I completely lost my composure. The anger, the frustration, it all boiled over. This wasn't just about a family feud. It was about everything that had led up to this moment, all the years of betrayal, manipulation, and hurt. I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. She had pushed me too far, and I had been holding it in for so long, trying to be the calm one, the sweet one. But enough was enough. I had lost a father, my father, and nothing could scare me anymore, not even the thought of losing another parent. I wasn't going to let her keep blaming me for her miserable life. She had done that enough. So, I yelled at her, loudly, and made it clear it wasn't me who had messed up. I reminded her of all the things she had said, the venomous words she'd used against my grandmother. Old hag, she had called her. Now that my father is gone, I don't want anything to do with her anymore, she had said. I wasn't going to let her pretend it was all on me. I wasn't the one who had always caused the problems, who had rejected my grandmother's invitation. No, she was the one who had ruined everything, and it was time for her to hear it. I didn't even know why my grandmother had invited the three of us for the weekend, to be honest. If I had known it was for some noble cause, I would have warned them, given them the chance to prepare. But in the end, maybe it was better they hadn't gotten that chance. They didn't deserve it. They took everything for granted and had no respect for anyone in their lives. Maybe this was the lesson they needed. She kept interrupting me, yelling back, trying to make me feel guilty, trying to make me stop. But all it did was fuel the fire inside me. The more she argued, the more I yelled, and the worse it got. The tension was unbearable. It felt like we were trapped in a spiral of rage. I must have gotten loud enough for my grandmother to hear because she came into my room. I saw her walking towards me, and before I knew it, she had grabbed the phone out of my hand, hung it up, and told me not to waste my energy on her. The relief washed over me the moment she left. My grandmother had made the right call. I was so upset, and it was just pointless. Arguing with her was like trying to reason with a wall. I couldn't change her. She wasn't going to suddenly see my side. She would always be the same selfish, narcissistic person. So, what was the point of fighting? It wasn't worth it. I wasn't going to waste any more energy on her. Now, I'm just trying to calm myself down. I'm trying to process everything, to figure out how to deal with the mess of emotions inside me. As time passed, more questions surfaced. People kept asking me about the real reason my mother and my grandmother didn't get along, and I didn't have an answer. I had been avoiding those questions, not wanting to delve into the painful past. But something inside me told me it was time to face it. I needed to know the truth. It concerned me. I had the right to understand why my family was torn apart. I couldn't ask my mother, not after what happened on the phone, but there was someone who might know. So, I went to my grandmother, asking her straight up, "Why doesn't Mom get along with you?" She looked surprised, almost like she hadn't expected me to ask after all this time, but she didn't shy away from the truth. And here's what I found out. Before my parents got married, my mom had talked about quitting her job and staying home as a wife. But my grandmother wasn't having it. She flat out told her no. The first reason was practical. My dad already had a full-time housekeeper. Why did my mom need to stay at home and do nothing? The second reason? My grandmother knew that if my mom stayed home, she would never go back to work, and she would be financially dependent on my dad for the rest of their marriage. It wouldn't just be about love, it would be about money. So, my grandmother stood her ground and told my dad she wouldn't allow her daughter-in-law to sit idle. My mom had to be a working woman if she was going to marry my dad. It wasn't about her being a gold digger, and that was what my grandmother feared. Eventually, my mother agreed, and they got married. But after that, the tension between my mom and my grandmother grew. My mother never forgave her for doubting her intentions. And I didn't know how to feel about all of this. I could understand why my mom would feel insulted, but at the same time, I couldn't blame my grandmother for being cautious. My family had money, and I know that makes people question motives. I guess it's hard to say who was right and who was wrong. But for me, right now, I feel that my grandmother is the one who's truly looking out for me. And that's where I stand. It's been a couple of weeks since that phone call with my mom. We haven't spoken since. From what I know, she took down the post she had made, along with all the photos of me from her social media. It's like I never existed. She's pretending she only has one daughter, and it hurts. It cuts deep. But I have to deal with it. This is the path she's chosen for herself, and I can't change that. On a brighter note, I have some good news. I got accepted into the business school my dad wanted me to attend. I'm beyond thrilled, words can't even describe it. When I saw that acceptance email, I honestly think I screamed loud enough for the entire state to hear me. My grandmother is over the moon, but no one is happier than I am. It's not just that I got into a great school, it's that I kept my promise to my dad. I've been working so hard for this moment, and it feels like all the effort has finally paid off. Now, I'm one step closer to taking over my dad's business, just as he had wanted. And that, to me, is the greatest achievement.